Everyone thought he'd drowned until a fisherman found his shoes 18 years later. The salt spray tasted like ghosts. For 18 years, Silas Blackwood had cast his nets into the churning grey mouth of the Pacific. And for 18 years, the ocean had kept its secrets. It was a fickle beast, this stretch of Oregon coastline. One day it would offer up a bounty of Dungeness crab, their shells the color of a bruised sunset. The next, it would swallow a man whole, leaving nothing behind but a widow's wail carried on the wind. Silas had seen it happen. He'd been one of the last to see Julian Thorpe, alive and breathing, before the sea took him. Or so everyone believed. The morning air was thick and cold, a damp shroud that clung to his oilskins. The engine of his trawler, the Sea Serpent, chugged a rhythmic comforting tune against the percussive crash of waves against the hull. It was a sound Silas knew better than his own heartbeat. He was a creature of habit, a man etched and weathered by the sea, his face a roadmap of sun squints and worry lines. At 63, his hands were gnarled claws, the knuckles swollen, the skin permanently stained with the faint metallic scent of fish blood and brine. He worked alone, had for years. It was easier that way. The ocean didn't make small talk. He was hauling in the morning's first crab pot, the winch groaning under the strain. The wire cage, heavy and dripping, rose from the depths like a skeletal treasure chest. Usually, it was a moment of quiet anticipation. Would it be a good haul? Enough to cover fuel and then some. But today, something was wrong. The pot was heavier than it should be, an unnatural dead weight that made the winch motor whine in protest. It wasn't the familiar scuttling weight of crabs. It was something dense, settled, and wrong. As the cage broke the surface, sloshing a torrent of seawater onto the deck, Silas saw it. Tangled in the wire mesh, snagged among the furious, clacking crabs and strands of kelp, was a shoe. Not just any shoe. It was a man's hiking boot, a heavy-duty leather thing, the kind built to last. The leather was waterlogged and dark, almost black, but the distinctive triple stitching along the seams was still visible, a faint, ghostly yellow. The laces were gone, rotted away, but the brass eyelets were still there, green with the patina of long submersion. It was the weight of it that was most unsettling. It wasn't empty. Silas's breath hitched in his throat. His heart, that old reliable drum, began to beat a frantic, panicked rhythm against his ribs. He cut the winch, letting the pot hang, dripping and swaying, just above the deck. He stared at the boot, a cold dread coiling in his gut. It was impossible. After all this time, impossible. He grabbed a gaff hook, his hands trembling slightly, and carefully, painstakingly, began to work the boot free from the wire. The crabs, agitated and angry, snapped their claws at him, but he barely noticed. His focus was entirely on that single, waterlogged object. It came loose with a sucking squelch, landing on the deck with a heavy, sickening thud. And then he saw the other one. It was still inside the pot, half buried under a heap of seaweed and a particularly large, belligerent male crab. The matching boot. He worked faster now, a frantic energy seizing him. He tipped the cage on its side, spilling its contents onto the deck in a chaotic, clattering heap. Crabs scattered, scuttling for the scuppers, but Silas ignored them. He snatched up the second boot. It was just as heavy as the first. He placed them side by side on the worn wooden planks of his deck. They were old, but they were good boots. Expensive. The kind a man buys for life. The kind Julian Thorpe wore, Silas knew. He'd sold them to him. He'd worked part-time at the coastal outfitter back then, to make ends meet when the fishing was lean. He remembered Julian coming in, a week before he disappeared. He'd been excited, talking about a new trail he wanted to explore, a rugged, cliffside path that snaked north of the bay. Need something that can handle the rocks. See, he'd said, his voice full of that easy, confident charm. Something that won't quit on me. Silas had recommended these boots. He'd even laced them up for him, showing him the special knot that wouldn't come undone. And now, here they were. Pulled from the belly of the ocean, 18 years later. But it wasn't just the boots. It was what was inside them. With a deep, shuddering breath, that seemed to draw all the cold, salty air from the world into his lungs. Silas knelt. He reached a trembling finger towards the opening of the first boot. He could see something pale inside. He hooked his finger under it and pulled. It was a bone. A human foot bone, bleached and strangely smooth, nestled inside a rotted wool sock. The small, delicate bones of the ankle and foot, still articulated, held together by stubborn, preserved ligaments. A wave of nausea washed over him. He stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth, the taste of bile rising in his throat. He leaned against the railing, his knuckles white, and stared at the two boots, standing there on his deck, like a pair of grim sentinels. They weren't just shoes. They were tombs. Tiny leather sarcophagi. The official story had been so simple, so clean. Julian Thorpe, 35, a charismatic architect from Portland who'd moved to the small coastal town of Port Blossom for a quieter life, had gone for a hike on a notoriously treacherous stretch of coast. A sudden squall had blown in, a rogue wave had swept him from the cliffs, and the Pacific had claimed him. His car was found at the trailhead. His wife, the beautiful, fragile Alara, had been devastated. The town had mourned. A search party had combed the beaches for days, finding nothing but a tattered windbreaker snagged on a piece of driftwood. It was a tragedy, they'd all said. A terrible, tragic accident. The sea gives, and the sea takes. But the sea doesn't give a man back in pieces, perfectly preserved in his own shoes. The boots were weighted. Silas could feel it now, a deep, primal certainty that resonated in his own bones. He picked one up. Again, his revulsion warring with a grim, burgeoning curiosity. He turned it over. There, caked with mud and marine growth, drilled crudely through the thick rubber sole, was a hole. And stuffed inside that hole, wedged in with a force that must have been brutal, was a cylinder of lead, a fishing weight, a heavy one. The kind used for deep-sea trolling. His blood ran cold. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a drowning. A man swept off a cliff by a wave doesn't have lead weights stuffed into the soles of his boots. This was an execution. Julian Thorpe hadn't been taken by the sea. He'd been sent to the bottom of it. He'd been sunk. The implications crashed over Silas with the force of a physical blow. For 18 years, a lie had settled over Port Blossom like a fog. A comfortable, convenient lie. And he, Silas, had helped cement it. He'd been one of the key witnesses. He'd told the sheriff's deputy everything he remembered from that day. He'd seen Julian's car at the trailhead. He'd seen the storm roll in, fast and violent. He'd even seen a figure on the cliffs, far in the distance. Just before the sky opened up, a lone hiker, he'd assumed. Julian. But had it been? The figure had been too far away to make out clearly, a silhouette against a bruised sky. He'd told the police he thought it was Julian, because it made sense. Because everyone wanted it to make sense. It was easier to believe in the random cruelty of the ocean than in the calculated cruelty of a man. Now, that comfortable story was shattering. The pieces were reassembling themselves into something monstrous. Who would do this? Why, Julian had been well liked, a bit of a city slicker, for their small town, maybe, but friendly. Always had a smile and a wave. He and Alara had been the town's golden couple, restoring the old lighthouse keeper's cottage on the point. Their love story, a beacon of hope for the jaded and lonely. But there had been whispers. There were always whispers in a town, this small whispers about money. Julian's firm in Portland had been involved in a big, controversial development deal before he left. There were rumors of angry investors, of promises broken. And there were whispers about his wife, Alara, so beautiful, so ethereal, and so close to Marcus Thorne, the town's de facto patriarch. Marcus Thorne, the name landed in Silas's mind, with the same heavy thud as the boots on his deck. Thorne owned half the town. The cannery, the marina, the biggest hotel. He was a man of immense unspoken power, his influence woven into the fabric of Port Blossom. He had been Julian's friend, his mentor, even he'd taken Julian under his wing when he'd first moved to town. He'd been the one to comfort the grieving widow, his arm a steady presence around Ilara's shoulders at the memorial service. He'd been a pillar of strength for the whole community. Silas's gaze drifted from the boots on his deck to the shoreline, to the distant point where the old lighthouse stood, its white tower stark against the grey sky. Ilara still lived there. After Julian's death, Marcus had helped her. He'd managed Julian's estate, settled his affairs. He'd made sure she was taken care of. That's what everyone said. He was just being a good friend, a good man. But Silas had seen things, little things, that hadn't seemed like anything at the time. The way Marcus looked at Ilara when he thought no one was watching. The way his hand lingered on her back, just a second too long. The way Ilara, in the months after Julian's death, seemed less like a grieving widow and more like a bird in a gilded cage. He felt a sudden, chilling certainty, the kind of gut-deep knowledge that bypasses reason and logic. He looked back at the boots, at the crude holes drilled in the soles, at the lead weights. This wasn't the work of an angry investor from the city. This had been personal. This had been savage. This had the quiet, brutal efficiency of someone who knew the sea. Someone who knew how to make a body disappear forever. Someone who knew that if you weighted the feet, the corpse would stay down, anchored to the seabed, while the rest of it was slowly, inexorably consumed by the creatures of the deep. It was a fisherman's trick, a local's trick. The chugging of the sea serpent's engine suddenly sounded loud, intrusive, a violation of the tomb-like silence that had fallen over the boat. The world had tilted on its axis. The past wasn't the past. It was right here, on his deck, stinking of salt and rot and an 18-year-old murder. What was he supposed to do? He was just an old fisherman, a nobody. To go to the police now? With this accusation dredged up from the bottom of the sea. It would be his word against Marcus Thorne's. And in Port Blossom, Marcus Thorne's word was law. The sheriff, Dale Hardy, was a Thorne man. Always had been. He played poker with Marcus on Thursday nights. His son worked as a manager at Thorne's cannery. Going to Hardy would be like reporting a fox to the farmer who owned the henhouse. He could throw them back. He could cut the lead weights out, toss the boots and the bones back into the abyss, and pretend he'd never found them. He could go back to his quiet life, to his solitary routine. He could let the lie settle back over the town, comfortable and safe. It would be the smart thing to do. The safe thing to do. Marcus Thorne was not a man to cross. But, as he looked at the boots, he saw Julian Thorpe's face. He saw him in the outfitter's shop, his eyes bright with excitement, talking about the future. About the house he was building, about the life he was creating with the woman he loved. Something that won't quit on me, he'd said. And someone had made sure they did. Someone had taken that life, that future, and snuffed it out. They had filled his boots with lead and sent him to a cold, dark grave, while they walked free under the sun. The injustice of it was a physical thing. A hot, metallic taste in Silas's mouth. He couldn't throw them back. He couldn't be a part of the lie, not anymore. His heart was still pounding, but the panic was receding, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He didn't know what he was going to do, not exactly, but he knew he couldn't stay silent. He had to do something. For Julian, for the truth, he carefully wrapped the boots and their gruesome contents in an old oilcloth. His movements precise and deliberate. He tucked the bundle away in a dry locker, a place no one would think to look. He cleaned the deck, scrubbing away the last traces of the mud and seaweed that had clung to them, washing the evidence of his discovery back into the sea. But he couldn't wash away the knowledge. He couldn't wash away the image of those pale bleached bones. He turned the sea serpent back towards the harbor, the crab pot forgotten, the day's profits irrelevant. The familiar shoreline of Port Blossom came into view, the quaint storefronts, the church steeple, the tidy houses clinging to the hills. It had always looked like a postcard to him, a peaceful, idyllic little town. Now, it looked like a mask. A beautiful, smiling mask, hiding a rotten, skeletal secret. And he was the only one who knew. The only one who had seen the skull beneath the skin. As he guided his boat into its slip, he saw a familiar figure standing on the dock, watching him. It was Sheriff Hardy. He was leaning against a piling, arms crossed, his mirrored sunglasses hiding his eyes. He wasn't smiling, he was just watching, waiting. And in that moment, Silas Blackwood knew that his life, the quiet, solitary life he had so carefully constructed, was over. The sea had given up its dead, and now it was demanding a reckoning. A cliffhanger that had been 18 years in the making was about to break. Julian Thorpe was the ghost Port Blossom had agreed to forget. He existed now only in yellowed newspaper clippings and in the carefully curated memories of those who had known him. To the town, he was a cautionary tale, a handsome, tragic footnote in its history. But to his younger sister, Maya, he was an open wound, a raw, aching void that 18 years had failed to heal. Maya was a journalist, a damn good one. She worked for a Seattle investigative news site, chasing down stories of corporate malfeasance and political corruption. She was sharp, relentless, and fueled by a righteous fury that had been forged in the crucible of her family's tragedy. She had never believed the official story, not for a second. Julian, her Julian, was a meticulous planner. He was a strong swimmer, a certified diver. He respected the ocean. He wasn't careless enough to be swept away by it. She knew, with the unshakable certainty of sibling intuition, that something was deeply wrong with the narrative the town had so readily accepted. She remembered the last time she'd seen him. 2 weeks before, he vanished. He'd driven up to Seattle, a rare visit. He'd seemed agitated. There were dark circles under his eyes, a new tension in his jaw. He'd been drinking more than usual, scotch, neat. He'd talked vaguely about a deal gone sour, about bad blood with a former business partner in Portland. But when she'd pressed for details, he'd waved her off with a forced smile. "It's nothing, May, just business stress. That's why I moved to the coast, remember? To get away from all this." But his eyes told a different story. They were haunted, and he'd talked about Ilara. His voice, usually so full of adoration, when he spoke her name, had a strange, brittle edge. "She loves the lighthouse," he'd said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Loves the view, loves the attention." There was a bitterness there she'd never heard before. He'd confessed that he felt isolated in Port Blossom, that Ilara was completely enthralled by their new friend and benefactor, Marcus Thorne. "The man's a king in that town," Julian had muttered, his voice low, "and Ilara she loves." A court. The words had chilled Maya then, and they haunted her now. They were the words of a man who suspected he was losing his wife. After his disappearance, Maya had tried to investigate. She'd driven down to Port Blossom, a 24-year-old journalism student, armed with a notebook and a burning need for answers. But the town had closed ranks around her. Sheriff Hardy had been patronizing, patting her on the shoulder, and telling her she needed to accept the tragic reality. "Your brother took a risk, little lady. The ocean doesn't play fair." Marcus Thorne had been smoother, a portrait of paternal concern. He'd met with her in his opulent wood-paneled office, offering her tea and condolences. He spoke of Julian with deep affection, calling him a son. He assured her he was doing everything in his power to support poor, devastated Ilara. And Ilara. Ilara had been a ghost. A beautiful porcelain doll, shattered into a million pieces. When Maya had visited her at the lighthouse cottage, she'd found her wrapped in a cashmere blanket, staring out at the grey sea, her eyes vacant. She'd flinched when Maya tried to hug her. She'd answered her questions in monosyllables, her voice a fragile whisper. She seemed utterly broken. But even then, a small, cynical part of Maya had wondered if the performance was just a little too perfect. A year later, when she'd heard that Ilara had married Marcus Thorne, the man who was old enough to be her father, the cynical part of her had screamed. But she had no proof, no evidence, just a sister's gut feeling and a collection of whispers. That amounted to nothing. She had eventually retreated, defeated, back to her life in Seattle. The mystery of her brother's death, an unsolved case file in the back of her mind. The antagonist, Marcus Thorne, was a man carved from the granite of the Oregon coast. He was 68 now, but he carried himself with the vigor of a man 20 years younger. His wealth was old, generational, built on timber and canneries and shrewd real estate deals. He had the kind of power that didn't need to be announced. It was simply understood. He moved through Port Blossom with an air of benevolent ownership, as if the town itself were one of his many assets. He was charming, philanthropic, a pillar of the community. He had funded the new wing of the library, sponsored the high school football team, and personally paid for the medical bills of more than one struggling family. To most, he was a saint, but beneath the polished veneer was a core of ruthless ambition. Marcus Thorne did not like to lose. He had lost his first wife to cancer decades ago, and he had never remarried, pouring all his energy into building his empire. He collected things, businesses, properties, art, and people. When Julian and Elora Thorpe had arrived in Port Blossom, he had seen something he wanted. Julian was a brilliant architect, a useful connection to the booming Portland development scene. But it was Elora who had truly captivated him. She was young, beautiful, cultured, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn simplicity of the town. She was a prize, a masterpiece to be acquired. He had befriended them, showered them with generosity. He'd helped them secure the Lighthouse Cottage, a property he secretly owned through a shell corporation. He'd advised Julian on local permits and contractors, all the while subtly driving a wedge between the couple. He'd preyed on Julian's insecurities, the city boy's feeling of being an outsider. He'd cultivated Elora's vanity, flattering her, telling her she was wasted on a man who was always distracted by work. He was patient, a predator. He had seen a crack in their marriage, and he had expertly, methodically, widened it until it was a chasm. He didn't just want Elora, he wanted to obliterate his rival. He wanted to win. And then there was the hidden witness. Not Silas, the fisherman who had found the evidence, but someone who had seen the crime. Liam Kane. Back then, Liam had been a 17-year-old kid, a high school dropout with a chip on his shoulder, and a burgeoning drug problem. He was a ghost himself, living in a rundown trailer on the edge of town, doing odd jobs for cash, most of which went to feeding his habit. He was invisible to people like Marcus Thorne and the Thorpes, a piece of human driftwood. On the night Julian disappeared, Liam had been on the cliffs for his own desperate reasons. He was supposed to be meeting a dealer, a shady character from up the coast. He was hiding in a small wind-hollowed cave just below the main trail, shivering, jonesing, waiting. The storm was rolling in, the sky turning a sickly shade of purple-gray. That's when he saw them. Two men, arguing. He recognized them both. Julian Thorpe, the new guy from the city, and Marcus Thorne, the king of the town. Their voices were snatched by the rising wind, but their body language was clear. It was heated, hostile. Julian was agitated, jabbing a finger at Thorne. Thorne was calm, stone-like. Liam had watched, his curiosity piqued. This was a side of the town's benevolent ruler he'd never seen. Then, a third person had arrived. A woman, her blonde hair whipped into a frenzy by the wind. Elora Thorpe. Her arrival changed everything. The argument escalated. Julian had turned to her, his voice full of anguish, pleading. Elora had said something back, something Liam couldn't hear, and then she had done something he would never forget. She had slapped Julian hard, a sharp cracking sound that cut through the wind. Julian had recoiled, stunned. And in that moment of shock, Marcus Thorne had moved. It was fast, brutally efficient. He stepped forward and shoved Julian, hard, in the chest. It wasn't a push to make a point. It was a shove to end a life. Julian, off balance, his back to the cliff edge, had no chance. He stumbled backward, his arms flailing, a look of pure, uncomprehending terror on his face. And then he was gone. Swallowed by the empty air, Liam had flattened himself against the back of the cave, his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd watched as Marcus Thorne put his arm around Elora, who was standing perfectly still, her face a mask of cold composure. They hadn't looked over the edge. They hadn't screamed for help. They had simply stood there for a moment. Two figures silhouetted against the storm, and then they had turned and walked away. Back down the trail, as if they were returning. From a casual evening stroll, fear, cold and absolute, had paralyzed Liam. He was a junkie, a nobody. Who would believe him? It would be his word against the most powerful man in the state. Thorne would crush him. The sheriff would laugh him out of the station, or worse, arrest him for being high. So he had stayed hidden. He'd waited until they were long gone, until the storm had fully broken, and then he had scrambled back to his trailer. The secret, a toxic poison in his veins. The secret had ruined him. He'd tried to forget it, to drown it in cheap whiskey and whatever pills he could get his hands on. But the image of Julian Thorpe's falling body was burned onto the back of his eyelids. It became the backdrop to every waking moment, the monster in every nightmare. He had left Port Blossom a year later, a haunted man. He drifted for years, from one dead-end job to another, the secret festering inside him. He was sober now, had been for 5 years. He worked as a long-haul trucker, the endless miles of Highway A kind of penance. He had a wife, a young daughter, a life he was terrified of losing. But the ghost of Julian Thorpe still rode with him in the passenger seat. He was a man caught between the terror of speaking up and the guilt of staying silent. These were the three threads: the relentless sister, the ruthless killer, the haunted witness that had been lying dormant for 18 years, and now, an old fisherman, hauling a crab pot from the bottom of the sea, was about to pull them all together, igniting a fire that would consume the peaceful, smiling town of Port Blossom. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Maya was in the middle of a heated editorial meeting, arguing with her editor about a source who was getting cold feet. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number with an Oregon area code. She almost ignored it, but something made her step out into the hallway and answer. "Is this Maya Thorpe?" The voice was old, gravelly, laced with the unmistakable cadence of the coast. "It is. Who's this?" "My name is Silas Blackwood. I'm a fisherman down in Port Blossom. I think I found something that belonged to your brother." Maya's world stopped. The noise of the newsroom, the argument with her editor, it all faded into a dull roar. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What did you find?" "His shoes," the old man said, his voice dropping lower. "His hiking boots, and Maya. They weren't empty." 2 days later, Maya was driving her beat-up Subaru down the Oregon coast, the sky the color of wet cement. She hadn't told anyone where she was going. She'd called in sick, a vague excuse about a migraine. This was hers. This was Julian's. She met Silas at a Greasy Spoon diner in a town 20 miles north of Port Blossom. He was exactly as she'd pictured him from his voice. Weathered, wary, with eyes that had seen too much. He slid a burlap-wrapped bundle across the sticky vinyl of the booth with trembling hands. Maya unwrapped it. The smell hit her first, the damp, musty odor of the deep ocean, and then she saw them. The boots, she recognized them instantly. Julian had been so proud of them. He'd called them his 7-league boots, capable of taking him anywhere. Now, they looked like relics from a shipwreck. She saw the crude holes in the soles, the lead weights still wedged inside, and she saw the small plastic evidence bag Silas had placed one of the footbones in. The sight of it, so clinical and so horrifying, shattered the dam of her composure. A sob escaped her, a raw, ragged sound she couldn't hold back. Silas just sat there, his gnarled hands wrapped around a coffee mug, his expression one of profound, weary sadness. He let her cry. When the tears subsided, replaced by a cold, familiar rage, she looked at him. "You didn't take this to the police." It wasn't a question. Silas shook his head. "Sheriff Hardy is Marcus Thorne's man. Always has been. Taking this to him would be like handing a death sentence to myself and a get-out-hove jail-free card to Thorne." The name hung in the air between them. Marcus Thorne. The man who had played the part of the grieving friend, the benevolent protector. The man who had married her brother's widow. "He killed him," Maya said, the words tasting like acid. "Thorne killed him, for Alara." "I think so," Silas said quietly. "But thinking isn't proving. He owns that town, Miss. The people. The police, the politicians. He's untouchable. No one is untouchable, Maya snarled, her grief hardening into diamond-sharp resolve. Not if you dig deep enough. Her return to Port Blossom was quiet, unannounced. She rented a small anonymous cottage on the outskirts of town, paying cash. She began to work the story like any other, but with a ferocity that was deeply personal. She was no longer a grieving sister, she was a predator, and she was hunting. Her first target was Alara. She found her at a charity luncheon at the Thorn Bay Country Club. Alara Thorn, no longer the fragile broken doll, was the queen of Port Blossom society. She was radiant, dressed in a cream-colored Chanel suit, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed. She moved through the room with an effortless grace, a polite smile fixed on her face. But her eyes, Maya noticed, were cold. They were the eyes of a woman playing a part she had played for so long it had become her reality. Maya cornered her near the silent auction tables. Alara turned, and for a fleeting second, a flicker of genuine shock, of fear, crossed her face. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a mask of cool surprise. Maya, what on earth are you doing here? I could ask. You the same thing, Maya said, her voice low and even. Last I saw you, you were a grieving widow. Now, you're the wife of the man who was supposed to be your husband's best friend. Funny how things work out. Alara's smile tightened. Life goes on, Maya. You, of all people, should understand that. Marcus was a rock for me. He saved me. Or he orchestrated the whole thing so he could have you, Maya shot back. Did you know Julian was trying to leave you? That he felt you were more interested in being the queen of Marcus Thorn's court than in being his wife? The shot hit its mark. A faint flush crept up Elaro's neck. That's a vicious lie. Julian and I were happy. Were you? I have his journals, Alara. It was a bluff, but a good one. He wrote about everything, about Thorn, about you, about how he was afraid. Ilara's composure finally cracked. Her eyes darted around the room, a hunted look appearing in them. I don't know what you're talking about, she whispered, her voice trembling. You need to leave, now. She turned and walked away. Her movements stiff, her poise shattered. The encounter was a small victory, but it was a start. It confirmed what Maya had long suspected. Alara was a prisoner in her own gilded cage. Terrified of the man she had married, Marcus Thorn was a much harder target. He was insulated by layers of wealth and power. Getting to him would be difficult. But Maya had an idea. She started digging into his finances, his business dealings, going back 20 years. She spent days in county records offices, poring over property deeds, tax assessments, and incorporation papers. She cross-referenced everything with Julian's old business records, which she'd kept in a box in her garage for 18 years. The work was tedious, a slow, painstaking process of connecting dots that were decades old. But then she found it. An anomaly, a shell corporation, North Coast Holdings LLC, that had been used to purchase the old lighthouse property a month before Julian and Alara had bought it. The registered agent for the LLC was Marcus Thorn's personal attorney. Thorn had owned the house all along. He had steered them to it, sold it to them, creating the illusion that he was helping them. He had been setting the stage from the very beginning. It was a piece of the puzzle, but it wasn't enough. It showed premeditation, but not murder. She needed more. She needed a witness. Finding Liam Kane was a shot in the dark. She remembered a name from her initial failed investigation 18 years ago. A local troublemaker who the police had questioned and dismissed. Liam Kane. He'd had a minor record for possession, had been seen near the cliffs around the time Julian disappeared. The police report had written him off as an unreliable junkie. But Maya wondered, she ran his name through every database she had access to. It took a week, but she finally found him. A trucking company based out of Boise, Idaho. She found a phone number. She called it, her heart pounding. A man answered, his voice wary. Yeah, is this Liam Kane? A long pause. Who's asking? My name is Maya Thorpe. My brother, Julian Thorpe, died in Port Blossom 18 years ago. I think you know something about it." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. She could hear the man's breathing, shallow and quick. She could picture him, in the cab of a truck, somewhere in the vast, empty heart of America. A ghost from his past reaching out to him through the phone. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice strained. "You have the wrong number." He hung up. Maya was undeterred. She had his address. Now, the next day, she was on a plane to Boise. She found him at a small, neat suburban house with a swing set in the backyard. The man who opened the door was not the teenage burnout she had imagined. He was in his mid-30s, with tired eyes and a face that looked like it had seen too much of the world. He was holding a little girl, no older than 4, with bright red hair. When he saw Maya, his face went pale. "You," he whispered. "We need to talk, Liam," Maya said softly, her eyes flicking to the child in his arms. "Not here, somewhere private." They met at a park down the street. Liam's hands were shaking. He kept looking over his shoulder, as if he expected Marcus Thorne to materialize from the Idaho landscape. "You can't be here," he said, his voice cracking. "He'll find out. He has people everywhere. You don't understand what he's capable of." "I think I do," Maya said. "He killed my brother, and you saw it, didn't you, Liam? You were on the cliffs that night." Liam broke. The secret he had carried for 18 years came pouring out of him in a torrent of guilt and fear. He told her everything. The argument, Ilara's arrival, the slap, the shove, the look on Julian's face as he fell. He wept as he spoke, great, shuddering sobs of a man unburdening a lifetime of shame. "I was a kid. I was scared," he choked out. "He would have killed me. I had nothing. No one who would have believed me." "I believe you," Maya said, her own eyes filling with tears. "And now, we're going to make everyone else believe you too." But Liam shook his head, a look of sheer terror on his face. No, you don't understand. I can't. I have a family now, a daughter. He'll come after them. He'll destroy everything. I can't testify. I can't." The conflict was escalating. Maya had found her witness, but he was terrified. Thorne's power reached far beyond the borders of Port Blossom. It was a long, dark shadow that had kept Liam silent for nearly 2 decades. Meanwhile, back in Port Blossom, Thorne was getting nervous. Ilara, unnerved by her encounter with Maya, had clearly told him of her return. The intimidation began subtly. A flat tire on Maya's car, a dead seagull left on her doorstep. Then, it escalated. One night, as she was driving back to her cottage, a large black SUV with tinted windows began to tailgate her, its headlights blazing in her rearview mirror. It followed her for miles down the dark, winding coastal highway, a menacing, silent predator. It was a clear message. "We see you, we can get to you, stop digging." The pressure was immense. Silas called her, his voice frantic. Sheriff Hardy had paid him a visit. He hadn't asked about the boots, not directly. It was a friendly visit, asking how the fishing was, reminding Silas how easy it would be for the state to revoke a fishing license for a minor infraction. The threat was unspoken, but crystal clear. Maya felt the walls closing in. She had the pieces of the story, the motive, the method, the witness. But her witness was too scared to talk, and her enemy was a ruthless, powerful man who was now actively trying to silence her. The injustice of it all was a fire in her veins. Thorne had lived a lie for 18 years, a respected, beloved figure. While her brother's bones lay at the bottom of the ocean, he had built his life on top of Julian's grave. She knew she was in danger. She knew she was pushing a man with nothing to lose to the edge, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. For Julian, she had to find a way to break Liam's fear. She had to find something that would force the truth into the light, something that even Marcus Thorne's power couldn't bury. The tension was stretched to its breaking point. The quiet war of whispers and intimidation was about to explode into open conflict. She just needed one more thing. One piece of irrefutable proof. A plot twist that would change everything. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected of places, Julian's own vanity. Maya was back in her Seattle apartment, surrounded by boxes of her brother's old things. She had brought them back from Port Blossom, hoping to find something, anything, she might have missed years ago. She was looking for a journal, a letter, a hidden note. Instead, she found a piece of technology that was, at the time, a novelty. It was a small digital voice recorder, no bigger than a pack of gum. Julian had been obsessed with it. He was an architect. He was constantly having ideas, making observations. He used it to record verbal notes to himself, descriptions of buildings, thoughts on design. Maya remembered him carrying it everywhere. She had assumed the police had collected it with his other belongings from the cottage, but here it was. Tucked away in a dusty box of old architectural magazines, her heart hammered against her ribs as she searched her apartment for the right kind of charging cable. A long obsolete USB to mini-B. After a frantic search through a drawer of old electronics, she found one. She plugged it in, her hands trembling. A small red light flickered on. It was still alive. She let it charge for an hour that felt like a lifetime. Then, with a deep breath, she unplugged it and pressed the play button. The first few recordings were exactly what she expected. Julian's voice, clear and confident, filled her small apartment, a voice she hadn't heard in 18 years. It was like a ghost in the machine. Note to self: check the load-bearing capacity of the western wall. Idea for the Henderson project: cantilevered balcony with glass railings. She listened for hours, the sound of his voice, both a comfort and a torment. She was about to give up, to dismiss it as another dead end, when she came to the last file. The date stamp was October 12th, the day he disappeared. The recording was different from the others. The sound was muffled, distorted by the rustle of fabric, as if the recorder was in his pocket. And the quality was terrible, overwhelmed by the sound of a howling wind and crashing waves. He must have activated it by accident. She turned the volume all the way up, pressing the speaker to her ear. For the first minute, all she could hear was the storm. Then, through the static, she heard voices, arguing. It was Julian. And Marcus Thorne. You think I don't know? Julian's voice was strained, furious. You think I'm that stupid? The house, the permits, all of it. You've been playing me from the beginning. Thorne's voice was smoother, colder. A voice of pure, reptilian calm. You're being emotional, Julian. I was helping you. Helping both of you. Helping me, or helping yourself to my wife. A pause. The wind howled. Then, Thorne's voice, dripping with condescension. Ilara needs a certain kind of life, a certain kind of man. You were a stepping stone, my boy, a charming diversion. But she was always meant for me. Maya felt the blood drain from her face. It was a confession. A full-throated, arrogant confession. Then, she heard another voice. Ilaris, Julian, stop it. You're making a scene. A scene. Julian's voice cracked with disbelief and heartbreak. He's telling me he's stolen my wife, my life, and you want me to be quiet. Is this what you want, Ilara? Him? There was a sound, a sharp, distinct smack, the slap. Liam had told her about the slap. And then, a grunt, a scuffle, a terrified choked-off scream that was swallowed by a gust of wind, and then, silence. Nothing but the sound of the wind and the sea. For a full minute, that's all there Maya was holding her breath, tears streaming down her face. Then, she heard Thorne's voice again, calm, collected, terrifyingly normal. Well, that's that. Then, Ilara's voice, a thin, reedy whisper. What have you done? I've solved a problem, Thorne said. Now, pull yourself together. We're going to walk back down this trail. We're going to go home. We were never here. Do you understand me, Ilara? We were never here. The recording ended. Maya sat in stunned silence, the small silver device clutched in her hand. It was the smoking gun. It was the plot twist. It was irrefutable. It wasn't just Liam's shaky testimony. against a powerful man anymore. It was Marcus Thorne's own voice, condemning himself. It was Alara's complicity, laid bare. The full, horrifying conspiracy, captured on a forgotten gadget. The stakes had just shifted seismically. This was no longer just about justice for Julian, this was about to become a massive public scandal. The beloved philanthropist, the titan of industry, exposed as a cold-blooded murderer. His queen, the grieving widow, exposed as his accomplice. Her first instinct was to release it. To send it to every news outlet on the West Coast, to watch the firestorm erupt. But she paused. A public explosion might be satisfying, but Thorne was slippery. He had lawyers who could tie this up in court for years, who could claim the recording was faked, who could paint Liam as an unreliable witness and her as a vindictive sister. No. The payoff had to be more direct, more personal. It had to be cinematic. She needed to deliver justice, not just a story. She flew back to Boise the next day. She didn't call Liam, she went straight to his house. He opened the door and the color drained from his face when he saw her. "Please," he whispered, his eyes pleading. "Leave me alone." "I'm not here to ask you to testify, Liam," she said, her voice steady. "I'm here to show you something." She played him the recording. He listened, his face a mask of horror and vindication. He heard the argument he had only partially overheard. He heard the confession, he heard the slap, he heard his own secret. Terror, mirrored in the silence after the scream. When it was over, he was shaking, but for a different reason. The fear was still there, but it was now eclipsed by something else, anger. He said it. Liam breathed. He admitted it. "That son of a bitch. He did," Maya said. "And now he's going to pay for it. But I need your help. Not to testify in a courtroom, for something else, something better." The plan she laid out was risky, theatrical, and borderline insane. It was a plan born from a journalist's instinct for a bombshell and a sister's thirst for vengeance. She wanted to expose Thorne, but not in a sterile courtroom. She wanted to do it in his kingdom, in front of his subjects, at the very moment of his greatest triumph. Every year, Marcus Thorne hosted the Port Blossom Founders Gala. A lavish, black-tie charity event that was the highlight of the town's social calendar. It was a celebration of him, thinly disguised as a celebration of the town. He gave a keynote speech every year, a self-congratulatory monologue about community, generosity, and the pioneering spirit. This year's gala was in 3 days. He's going to be on that stage, in a tuxedo, basking in the adoration of the entire town. Maya explained, her eyes burning with intensity. And while he's up there, talking about what a great man he is, the whole room is going to hear what he really is. She wanted Liam to be there, not to speak, but to stand, to be a visible symbol of the truth. When they hear that recording, they're going to look for a source, they're going to see you, the kid they all dismissed as a junkie, and they're going to know it's real. Liam stared at her, his mind reeling. It was terrifying. It meant going back there. It meant facing the monster from his nightmares. But the recording changed everything. It was proof. He wasn't alone anymore. "What about Elara?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Elara is the key," Maya said. "We need to break her before the gala. We need to make sure that when the bomb drops, she doesn't stand by him. She needs to be the one who confirms it." The day before the gala, Maya made her move on Elara. She didn't confront her in person. She sent her a package by courier, a small, elegant gift box. Inside, there was no note, just a single, brand-new digital audio player with a pair of expensive earbuds. There was only one file loaded on it. The tension was now at its absolute peak. All the pieces were in place. The recording was the bomb. The gala was the stage. And the entire town of Port Blossom was about to become the audience for a finale 18 years in the making. Maya felt a strange, terrifying calm. She had set the trap. Now, all she could do was wait, and pray that when it snapped shut, it would catch the monster who had haunted her for half her life. The ballroom of the Thorne Bay Country Club was a sea of glittering gowns and black tuxedos, crystal chandeliers dripped light onto tables laden with champagne flutes and elaborate floral centerpieces. The air buzzed with the self-important chatter of Port Blossom's elite. It was Marcus Thorne's court, and tonight he was king. Maya stood at the back of the room, dressed in a simple black dress, a ghost at the feast. She was invisible, just another face in the crowd. Across the room, near the stage, she saw Liam. He was wearing a borrowed suit that was a little too big in the shoulders. He looked pale, terrified, but he was there. He met her gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Silas was there too, standing by the bar, his fisherman's frame, looking awkward and out of place in a stiff blazer. He was her rock, her anchor in this sea of sharks. Then she saw Elara. She was seated at the head table, next to the empty chair where her husband would soon sit. She looked breathtakingly beautiful in a silver gown, but her beauty was brittle. Fragile, her face was ashen. Her eyes kept darting towards the ballroom entrance, a hunted animal sensing the closing of a trap. She was clutching a small beaded purse in her lap. Maya knew, with absolute certainty, that the audio player was inside it. Elara had listened. She knew what was coming. The question was, what would she do? A hush fell over the room as the master of ceremonies, a fawning local news anchor, stepped up to the podium. And now, it is my distinct honor to introduce a man who needs no introduction, a pillar of our community, a true visionary, and a dear friend. Ladies and gentlemen, the founder of Port Blossom, Mr. Marcus Thorne. The room erupted in thunderous applause. Marcus Thorne walked onto the stage, beaming, waving to the crowd. He was the picture of success and benevolence, a silver-haired lion in his prime. He soaked in the adoration, his smile wide and confident. He had no idea he was walking into his own public execution. He began his speech, his voice smooth and resonant, amplified by the sound system. He spoke of progress, of community, of the bright future of the town he had built. Maya felt a surge of nausea. Every word was a lie, a layer of polish on a rotten core. She gave a subtle signal to the man standing by the AV booth at the back of the room. He was a freelance sound engineer she had hired from Portland. A professional who had been paid a very large sum of cash for a very specific 5-minute job. He'd been instructed to patch an external audio source directly into the main speaker system at a precise moment. Thorne was reaching the climax of his speech. It is in the spirit of friendship, of looking out for our neighbors, that we find our true strength, he declared, his arms spread wide. It is the bedrock upon which this town was founded, and the legacy we must all strive to uphold. Now, Maya whispered into her phone. The sound engineer hit a button. Thorne's voice was cut off mid. For a second, there was confused silence. Thorne tapped the microphone, a flicker of annoyance on his face. And then, a new sound filled the ballroom. A sound of howling wind and crashing waves. It was faint at first, then grew louder, an eerie, ghostly sound that seemed to come from nowhere. The crowd murmured, confused. Thorne looked frantically towards the AV booth. And then came the voices. Julian's voice, furious and strained, echoed through the crystal chandeliers. ... You think I'm that stupid? You think I don't know? A collective gasp went through the room. On stage, Marcus Thorne froze. The blood drained from his face. His confident smile dissolved into a mask of pure slack-jawed horror. He stared out at the crowd, his eyes wide with disbelief. Own voice, cold and reptilian, answered from the speakers. Elara needs a certain kind of life, a certain kind of man. You were a stepping stone, my boy. The room was utterly silent now, save for the recording. Every eye was fixed on the stage, on the man who was being exposed, his own words, his executioner. Maya watched him, her heart pounding. She saw him see Liam, standing there, a living ghost. She saw him see Silas, his face a stony mask of judgment. And she saw him look at his wife. Elara's voice, thin and reedy, filled the room. Julian, stop it. You're making a scene. The slap, the scream, the terrible final silence, and then the final damning words from Thorne himself. "Well, that's that then. I've solved a problem." The recording ended. The sound of the wind faded, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. No one moved, no one breathed. The entire town, his entire kingdom, had just heard the truth. Marcus Thorne stood on the stage, trembling, exposed, stripped bare. His empire of lies had crumbled in the space of 2 minutes. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. A choked, gurgling sound, and then, a new sound. The sound of a chair scraping back. Ilara stood up. Every eye in the room swiveled. To her, she looked small, fragile, under the glare of the stage lights. She took a tentative step forward, then another. She walked onto the stage, her silver gown shimmering. She didn't look at the audience. She looked only at the man she had married, the man who had been her savior and her jailer. She stopped in front of him. He looked at her, his eyes pleading, desperate. A silent, frantic appeal for her to deny it, to save him. She picked up the microphone from the podium. Her hand was shaking, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear and cold. It carried to every corner of the silent, stunned room. "It's true," she said, every word. "He killed him, he pushed him, and I watched." It was the final nail in the coffin. A gasp, like a wave, rolled through the crowd. The spell was broken. The king was naked. The whispers started, then grew to a roar of outrage and horror. In that moment, 2 uniformed police officers, state troopers Maya had contacted and briefed just hours before, bypassing Sheriff Hardy entirely, stepped into the ballroom. They walked calmly, deliberately, through the parting crowd and up the steps of the stage. They didn't look at Ilara. They walked straight to Marcus Thorne. One of them pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The click of the metal locking around Thorne's wrists echoed through the sound system. A sharp, final, percussive sound. "Marcus Thorne," one of the troopers said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You are under arrest for the murder of Julian Thorpe." Thorne didn't resist. He seemed to have collapsed inward, all the power and arrogance gone, leaving only a shrunken, terrified old man. As they led him off the stage, through the crowd that now shrank away from him in disgust, he looked at Maya. His eyes were filled with a dawning, venomous hatred. He knew it was her. Maya just stood there, watching him go, feeling a strange, hollow emptiness where she had expected to feel triumph. It was over. The lie was dead. The troopers went to Ilara next. "Ma'am," one said gently, "you'll need to come with us." She nodded, a single tear finally tracing a path down her cheek. She looked out at the crowd, at the wreckage of her life, and then her eyes found Maya's. It wasn't a look of apology, or of gratitude. It was a look of bleak, shared understanding. A look that acknowledged the terrible, ruinous price of the truth. The cinematic payoff was complete. It wasn't just an arrest. It was a public shaming, a dethroning, a scandal that would be talked about for generations. Julian Thorpe had finally gotten his justice, not in a quiet courtroom, but in a glittering ballroom, in front of the very people his killer had deceived for so long. The ghost of Port Blossom had finally been heard. The aftermath was a quiet echo, a long, slow exhale after the explosion. The scandal didn't just break the internet. It shattered the carefully constructed facade of Port Blossom. The story was everywhere. National news, true crime podcasts, morning talk shows. The handsome architect, the beautiful wife, the powerful tycoon. It was a story made for headlines. Marcus Thorne's empire crumbled overnight. His businesses went into receivership. His political allies deserted him. And his name became a synonym for monstrous hypocrisy. The trial was a formality. With the recording, Ilira's confession, and Liam's corroborated testimony, the prosecution's case was airtight. Marcus Thorne was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He died of a heart attack in his cell 6 months later, a forgotten man. Ilara, in exchange for her testimony, was convicted of manslaughter and accessory to murder. She served 7 years in a low-security facility. No one ever heard from her again. Sheriff Hardy was forced into early retirement, disgraced. His complicity in the cover-up, an open secret that stained the town's police force for years. Maya stayed in Port Blossom for a few more weeks, watching the ripples spread. She wrote the definitive story of her brother's murder, a long-form investigative piece that won her a Pulitzer. It was the pinnacle of her career, but it brought her no joy. The victory felt hollow, the justice bittersweet. It had come at too high a cost, and it couldn't bring Julian back. One cool, overcast afternoon, she drove out to the cliffs, the place where it had all happened. She walked the trail, the wind whipping her hair, the sea crashing below, a constant, mournful roar. She found the spot, the place Liam had described, the place she had heard on the recording. There was no marker, no sign of the violence that had occurred there. Just rock, and wind, and sky. She wasn't alone. Silas Blackwood was there, standing a few feet away, looking out at the grey horizon. He had his own ghosts to make peace with. Used to think the sea was what took him, Silas said, his voice rough against the wind. But the sea is honest. It's people who are cruel. Thank you, Silas, Maya said, her voice thick with emotion. For everything. You didn't have to get involved. The old fisherman shook his head. Some things you can't throw back. Some things you have to haul into the light, no matter how heavy they are. They stood there in silence for a long time, two solitary figures bound by a shared, tragic, secret. Before she left Port Blossom for good, Maya did one last thing. She commissioned a simple granite bench to be placed at the trailhead. The inscription was short, taken from one of Julian's architectural notebooks. Julian Thorpe, 1967 to 2002. The measure of a space is the memory it holds. It wasn't a grave marker, but a memorial, a quiet acknowledgement of the life that had been lived, and the memory that had finally been set right. Liam Kane went back to his life in Boise. He had faced his monster, and won. The fear that had haunted him for 18 years was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. He had done the right thing, and in doing so, he had saved himself. He would never forget Julian Thorpe, but the ghost no longer rode in his passenger seat. He was free. Maya's life moved on. She continued her work, but something inside her had shifted. The fire of her rage had cooled to embers. The wound of Julian's death would never fully heal, but it was no longer an open, gaping void. It was a scar, a part of her, a tragic reminder of the cost of truth. Years later, an old woman now, she returned to Port Blossom one last time. The town had changed. The Thorn name had been scrubbed from buildings. The country club had a new name, and a new generation had grown up, for whom the scandal was just a local legend. She went to the trailhead and sat on her brother's bench. It was weathered now, the granite softened by years of salt and rain. A young couple walked past, holding hands, laughing. They glanced at the bench, at the inscription, and then continued on their way. Oblivious, Maya smiled, a sad, faint smile. The world kept turning. Life went on. But the memory was held. The truth was anchored. And somewhere, out in the vast grey expanse of the Pacific, the ghost of Julian Thorpe was finally at peace, his 7-leg boots having finally carried him home. The story was over, but the emotional echo, the haunting reflection on justice, loss, and the corrosive nature of secrets, would linger forever in the salt-laced air of the Oregon coast.